All right, hello everybody and welcome back. This is the beginning of Unit 9, Civil Rights. And as you take out your journal and you begin to write your heading for this, our 9th unit, remember to write down the unit title, Modern Civil Rights Movements, the lesson title, Early Modern Civil Rights Movement. We're starting off in the 1950s with this lesson, and really actually going farther back to give some background. And don't forget the EQ. What are civil rights and how did activists fight segregation? As you do this, think about that question. What are civil rights? You'll hear it all the time, but what does it really mean? Civil rights are your civil liberties, your rights that you have as American citizens to be treated equally under the law. So really, when we say civil rights, we mean your equality, your protections that you should have to be treated the same as everybody else. That is civil rights. And again, it could also be referred to as civil liberties, your freedoms, your rights, your right to be treated equal. All right, let's go ahead and begin. So the last time we talked about the overall situation for African Americans in the United States, because we've been periodically discussing what's been going on. But the last time we really did this was in the Progressive era. And remember that after the Civil War in the 1860s, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. So slavery was officially ended. The 14th Amendment said that former slaves were now citizens entitled to, be treated equally under the law as all other citizens. And the 15th Amendment said that African American men, really men of all colors, should now have the right to vote, should not be deprived of that right to vote. Those are called the Reconstruction Amendments because they happened after the Civil War. But when Reconstruction ended around like 1876, remember that there's a lot of loopholes in those amendments that are going to be exploited by white supremacist Southern state governments and local governments. All right. And what we end up with after Reconstruction ends in most of the South is going to be the laws of segregation, better referred to as Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are the laws that basically separated whites and blacks and designated that there would be certain areas that only blacks could have, like water fountains, restrooms, restaurants. They would not be allowed to go to the white ones. And usually in almost all of these circumstances of segregation, what the blacks were being given and what they were forced to have, the black only stuff, like you can see in this picture here, the black water fountain, was not as nice as the white water fountain. The black school was not as nice as the white school. They did not have funding. Now, all of this really comes from this Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson that we're going to review in just a second, okay? But it's important to remember that from like the late 1800s up to this point, now in our history class that we're talking about, the 1950s, you have these laws of segregation instituted throughout the southern states, including our state of Texas. Those are the Jim Crow laws. Like blacks were not allowed by law to go and to the white areas. Now in middle states, in northern states, African Americans, they might be allowed to integrate or be with whites, or they might be segregated. See, in the North, it wasn't by law, it wasn't Jim Crow segregation, but sometimes they still had racism and segregation just based on cultural customs. Like if you lived in a community, say in Kansas or something, right, that's kind of in the middle of all of this, maybe one city does have segregation and then maybe the next city doesn't. It's just based on what they had in that city and where that city's coming from. So it's a little bit looser in organization in the North. There is still racism in the North, but it's not like strictly by law the way that it is in the South. And that system of cultural segregation, that's sometimes referred to as like de facto segregation instead of like de jure segregation, not de jure now, But de jure segregation is by law. That's Jim Crow laws. That's in the South. It was bad. Disenfranchisement means when you are denied the right to vote. This is something that is being discussed right now in the Supreme Court in 2021. They're talking about gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed all forms of voter discrimination and gave enforcement from the national government to make sure people were not being denied the right to vote based on any criteria such as your race or your gender or so on. Because previously in American history, this has been a really big problem, and it is today as well. You have southern states like Texas and like Arizona today that are trying to disqualify certain populations, such as African Americans or immigrants or others, from being able to vote, like based on their race. And so that's called disenfranchisement when you're trying to take away somebody's right to vote. And in the Jim Crow era of segregation in the South, there were many very blatant and sometimes subtle ways as well that Southern state governments were keeping Blacks from being able to vote. Because being able to vote is your say, it's your voice in our country. It's how you can affect change and try to make things better. If you're not able to vote, you basically don't exist according to the government, and you have no say, and you can't make anything better. You can't change anything. So hopefully you understand how critically important it is to vote. Hopefully you understand from like our 2020 election that we've just had. I'm recording this in March, but hopefully you remember like how big a deal the 2020 election was, or maybe, earlier in your life, you remember the 2016 election, or you remember maybe midterm elections like coming up next year in 2022. That's going to be a midterm election when we elect new Congress people, and lots of lower government positions as well that are just as important. Voting really does matter. It's your voice. And so that's why Southern governments tried so hard for so long to keep Black people from being able to vote, because they didn't want Black people to be able to make their lives any better, to be able to change things, to be able to like end segregation. So here's some of the tactics that were used in order to keep Blacks from voting. One of the most infamous was called the literacy tests. So every state government was in charge of its own voting system. So every state had like its own form of literacy test in the South, but all of them, their purpose was, let's make a test that sounds good on paper, like literacy means to be able to read and write. So by making you have this test, proving your reading and writing skills in order to vote, that seems like a reasonable thing. But in actuality, again, it's disenfranchisement. Its real purpose was just to keep Black people from being able to vote. And the way it would do this is that it wasn't just simply reading and writing. It was an impossible test. It's a test that's so difficult, like I couldn't pass it, okay? Professors and stuff, they couldn't pass it. It's literally circuitous logic. It's crazy, crazy, weird questions, like draw a line around a circle. How do you do that, right? I'm going to show you a video that kind of illustrates the ridiculousness of these literacy tests. But again, you would have to take this test in order to vote. And it was a test that was meant to be impossible to pass. It would have, like a lot of questions, and you'd have only like 10 minutes to get all of them right. If you made even one mistake, you couldn't vote. If you didn't finish them all in time, you didn't vote. You couldn't vote. And so that was the literacy test. It was a terrible, terrible disenfranchising practice that many Southern states used well into the 1960s, actually. Another way that Southern states are going to keep Black people from being able to vote. Oh, and by the way, sorry, one more thing about the literacy test. You might be wondering, well, if it's such an impossible test to pass, how did white people pass it? Well, it's not like white people were smarter or anything. They're not. It is true that white people had better opportunities for education at this time for certain. But again, remember, literacy test isn't about actually being able to read and write like it sounds. It's just dumb questions that are meant to like be impossible to get right. And white people would oftentimes not even have to take this test because they would be what's called grandfathered in. This is this grandfather clause idea right here. Grandfather clauses in the law means that if it applied or didn't apply to your grandfather, you get the same treatments. You're treated like your grandfather is, basically. So if your grandfather didn't have to take one of these literacy tests, grandfather clause means you would not have to take this literacy test as well. So that's how many whites got out of taking these tests. Sometimes, though, some white people did have to take these tests, and many poor, uneducated Southern whites, many of them who were forced to take this test, they also failed because it was impossible to pass. And so it did keep some whites from being able to vote as well. Another disenfranchising tactic that was used throughout the South to keep blacks from being able to vote was the poll tax. And the poll tax, that is where you would have to pay a fee literally in order to vote. Remember that many blacks after the Civil War had very little opportunities, and many of them were forced to become what's called a sharecropper, a poor tenant farmer who has to give a share of his crop at the end of every season to the landowner. And so with this lack of opportunities, many of these people were about as poor as you can be. And so they did not have money to spare for being able to vote. They're having a hard enough time just putting food on the table. So the poll tax was another way that it would keep blacks from being able to vote, especially, and poor whites. So those are some of the key disenfranchising tactics. And if you want to know, well, why did Jim Crow laws, why did segregation last for so long? This is why, because nothing can change unless, people's voices are heard. And if you couldn't vote, well, that means you're going to have to find some other way to have your voices heard. And this is where we get into the modern civil rights movement, when protest begins. Nonviolent civil disobedience. This is the protest of the modern civil rights movement that's going to begin in the 1950s. Again, here's this video I'd like you guys to watch for understanding the literacy test. And this video in particular was actually recorded, I think, in 2014. And it's Harvard students, like a Harvard University, really, good college, right, in Massachusetts. They are having a very difficult time taking this 1964 Louisiana State Literacy Test. So you can see just how dumb those questions are, that they're meant to literally be impossible. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about in our lecture today was the infamous, that means it's famous for a bad reason, Supreme Court decision from 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. Let me move my picture out of the way here. There we go. So Homer Plessy was an African-American man in the state of Louisiana. And this is the 1890s. There was a Louisiana state law, like many southern states, that said if you had any African-American ancestry whatsoever, like 8 generations back, you were considered black, no matter how light your skin was or how many white ancestors you had. If you had any African-American ancestors, you were black. And so this picture is actually misleading because Homer Plessy looked very light complexion. He looked very white-skinned. But because he had like a great-grandfather that was black, he was black under Louisiana state law. There was also a Louisiana state law that forbid black people from sitting at the front of a train car. And so a local civil rights organization, to fight this unfair law that they thought discriminated against the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment says that everyone born here is a citizen regardless of race and stuff, and that as a citizen, you're supposed to be treated equally under the law. Well, forcing blacks to sit at the back of a train car, that's kind of goes against the 14th Amendment. It violates it. So they basically requested if Homer Plessy could please get himself arrested under this law, and so they could fight this law in court and hopefully get this law thrown out as a bad law. So he does this and he gets arrested, and this case becomes Plessy for Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. Ferguson was the local Louisiana judge there. And this case winds up going all the way up to the Supreme Court on appeal. And the case before the Supreme Court, the question is this: is it okay for blacks to be segregated from whites? Is it okay to have segregation? like having separate train cars for blacks versus whites, or having separate schools for blacks versus whites. That is what is up before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is actually going to say yes. Now, this was a terrible decision, and it will eventually be thrown out over 50 years later in the case of Brown versus Board, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. A landmark, very important case that's going to basically end this segregation around the country. But in 1896, in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court based its decision that segregation was A-okay. They said because it does not violate the Equal Rights Clause of the 14th Amendment, that just because things are separate doesn't mean that they're not of the same quality. And so Plessy versus Ferguson basically established the doctrine of separate but equal, okay, segregation, okay? And because it's the Supreme Court saying that segregation was okay, that meant that now segregation was legalized everywhere. Every state could now legally segregate in the entire country. That's why Plessy versus Ferguson, this Supreme Court case, is considered one of the worst, up there with like the Dred Scott decision from the 1850s. So that's a very important decision you need to remember. Remember separate but equal doctrine. Basically, this case allows for segregation everywhere in the country. They said to get around the 14th Amendment that things could be separate as long as they were of the same quality. But we know in actuality, like look at this picture, just because things were supposed to be the same, just because things were supposed to be just equally as nice, did not mean in practice that it worked out that way. In fact, almost always, you can see here, here's the black school, it's like a shack, and here's the white school, it's this nice posh, 3-story brick thing, right? Those are not equal. They were supposed to be according to the 14th Amendment, but in reality, nothing was really ever equal, okay? And so that is Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, we're gonna stop there for our lecture today and get into the politics and then Brown versus Board in the next one. Thank you guys for listening. Don't do a summary yet. I will pick up with lesson 1 when we come back. Thank you guys very much.